Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions in Depth Psychology, which is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright. I also graduated from Pacifica with my own PhD in the Depth Psychology program there. And this series is dedicated to following the work of individuals and scholars who are really passionate about the work of depth psychology and who are also doing some of their own incredible work in the field. And today I'm going to be speaking with Maureen Murdock, who is a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist. And we're going to be talking about the topic of memoir. So Maureen, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thanks, Bonnie. I really appreciate this time together.
Yeah, I'm very excited about what we're going to be talking about because the topic of memoir can be really broad, but there's also a real art to it, as you know very well, of course. And so we'll be discussing much more about that in our time to come. But let me first just read your bio so that everybody has some background on you, and then we'll jump in.
Okay.
Maureen Murdock is a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist in private practice in Santa Barbara, California. She was chair and core faculty of the ME Counseling Psychology program at Pacifica, where she taught a course on memoir and myth. She continues as adjunct at Pacifica and taught in the Depth Psychology program at Sonoma State University. And she teaches memoir classes and workshops internationally, as well as teaching memoir in the UCLA Extension Writers Program since 1990. She's the author of the best-selling book, The Heroine's Journey, Women's Quest for Wholeness, which explores the rich territory of the feminine psyche and delineates the feminine psychospiritual journey. Murdock is also the author of Father's Daughters, Breaking the Ties That Bind, Unreliable Truth on Memoir and Memory, Spinning Inward, Using Guided Imagery with Children, and the Heroine's Journey Workbook. And she edited an anthology of her UCLA students' memoir writing entitled Monday Morning Memoirs, Women in the Second Half of Life. And her books have been translated into a dozen languages, including Farsi. Wow. She has written a memoir entitled Blinded by Hope, My Journey Through My Son's Bipolar Illness and Addiction, that will be published in June in 2017. You can find her blog posts about mental illness and the criminal justice system on her website at www.maureenmurdock.com. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that bio with us, Maureen, because there's so much in there. And, you know, I hadn't actually realized myself how many books you've actually written, and they are all so profoundly focused on, I see a lot of themes running through those. And of course, that is particularly the memoir and also the memory piece of it, which is really fascinating and interesting. And I should note, I guess, at this point that you are going to be part of an upcoming program at Pacifica, which is starting in March 2017, and that is a 9-month certificate program in writing memoir. And so that's very exciting to hear. That course is going to be taught by Jennifer Seelig, who many people know is faculty at Pacifica, and also by Daphne Dodson. And that is focused on memoir as a depth inquiry, a form of writing down the soul, as they talk about it. So that's very exciting, and I know that you will be at the 2 residentials that are involved in that. Most of that will take place online, I believe. And then, of course, the residentials will be at the beginning and then at the end of that certificate program. So I bet that you're looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about what you'll be sharing during those residentials in our conversation today as well.
Yeah, it's a brand new program. It's very exciting to have something that is ongoing like that. I teach a lot of memoir workshops that might be a weekend or a week, but to be able to be working with people over 9 months it's going to be fabulous for people.
Yeah.
I'm teaching at the 3-day residential in the beginning and the end, and then Jennifer will be carrying it throughout the 9 months.
It's just wonderful. And I know Daphne Dodson a bit too, and I just think that the opportunity, as you say, to be able to sink into and really immerse oneself into that process, I can only imagine that some people might actually be able to even finish a memoir during that period of time. So
yeah, or at least to get the bare bones down.
Yeah, I say it as if it were easy. And of course, I'm speaking to somebody who knows well that it's not always an easy process.
That's not easy. It took me 13 years to write my last memoir.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, well, I want to hear about that. So let's jump into to some of the conversation because there's so much that we have to talk about. First of all, I thought it might be a really good idea if we just start by discussing what is a memoir and how is it different than, say, an autobiography? Because most people are familiar with those terms, but may not have exactly a very concrete idea about what that is.
Yeah, that's a great question. Memoir is really basically taking a slice of a person's life. An autobiography starts pretty much with birth and goes until a person is famous enough to write an autobiography. And an autobiography is usually very linear. It involves a lot of facts. And a memoir is a person decides, okay, what is it that I want to focus on in my life? What do I want to find meaning out of? And it's not based on facts. It's based on the person's emotional truth. Of course, there are facts in there, but an autobiography, with an autobiography, you do a lot of research. You might bring in newspaper articles. You might bring in magazine pieces. Memoir, it's your story at a particular time in your life and what you've learned from it. So that's why it's a depth inquiry.
I suppose most people that have an idea about writing a memoir or a desire to write one have an idea about what they'd like to say to some extent. They probably have very specific experiences that they have have had in their lives, or maybe they have a theme that they would really like to address. Would you find that that's true for the most part, that people already know that they have something they want to say, or do people just want to somehow capture something about their life and kind of go into it more with that idea and then see what emerges?
I'd say both. I'd say that most people who come in with an agenda find out that that isn't where they end up. Because one of the great things about memoir, well, first of all, we're not a static self. You know, we're always an evolving self. So you might come in with a particular theme, but as you write about it, the theme expands. And part of that has to do with memoir. It has to be rooted in cultural facts, in historical facts, in gender, in race. And so you're not just focusing on your own experience, you're focusing on your experience within a much larger context. And so I find with my students, they'll come in and say, oh, you know, I really want to write about such and such. And by the end of writing their book, they've written something completely different. I had one student who had a great idea about writing about her junior year abroad, a junior year in college abroad in France. And she wanted to be just vignettes about that. But she realized that underlying that was her relationship with her father. So the book is a melding of both the letters that she was writing home to her mother during the time and not really telling her mother exactly what was going on, but it was informed by the fact that her father had died right before she took this junior year abroad. And so it made her really explore that relationship that had passed on. So I think memoir is just this fabulous experience of discovery, of archaeology. And one of the things that is great about a depth perspective is that as people start to write, their dreams inform their writing, myths inform their writing, synchronicities inform their writing. So that's the piece that I think Pacifica brings to memoir writing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love that you mentioned the word myth, or even that we, are talking a bit about mythology, because of course there's this idea in depth psychology that many people are familiar with, that we each have a personal myth. And so
Right.
we're living out some kind of an archetypal story or theme, either over the course of our lives or maybe at any given time or moment in our lives when specific events take place. And so I think that there's probably an aspect of that will show up as people begin to write about what they're
Yeah, definitely. When I was teaching myth and memoir at Pacifica, I developed a course called Myth and Memoir. The reason I did that is because as I was reading contemporary memoirs, I was seeing all of the mythic themes embedded in them, like who am I and what's my tribe and what's my journey, where am I on my journey and what's my purpose. All of those four domains of myth are embedded in people's memoirs, and they don't realize it at the time. But when I was writing Blinded by Hope, what I became very aware of is that I was living the Demeter Persephone myth, in a sense, the mother grieving for the lost child. And the image that kept coming up in the memoir was of the Pietà, of the mother holding the dead Christ. So I started to explore, both of those images. Even though the Demeter Persephone is the mother and the daughter, I was exploring the mother and the son.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so that's a great example of how these kinds of images or motifs can actually emerge into. I mean, anybody can read the myth and understand it, but I think that there's a process, it seems like, that kind of happens as people are going through this experience of kind of plumbing their own depths, so to speak, in order to see what actually emerges. And it's something bigger than our egoic self or even the memory self, even the part that can remember, conscious personal memories. There's something coming through there that emerges into that writing in the form of images. It seems like there's probably a couple of aspects to memoir writing that we haven't really talked about that might be really important to mention, and I know that will be offered in the course, will be addressed during the course. One is the theme of creativity and finding what emerges in the process of plumbing those depths. And then the second is that of healing. It seems like there's probably a certain aspect of healing that can actually occur through the writing of one's memoir. Can you maybe speak to both of those topics?
Yeah, I'd like actually to start with what are the elements of memoir, because that's where we need to start. The elements of memoir include a memory, certainly a memory that may go back to childhood. It may be something in adulthood, but what sparks that creative process is the memory. And no memory is too small. People think, oh, well, I can't write a whole memoir because, I can't explore a whole life. But it's so interesting what small memories will activate in a person's consciousness. So one of the elements is no memory is too small. Another is the universal idea, because a memoir has to include not just a person's personal experience, but it has to have an aspect of universal truth. How are other people going to relate to this memory? We're stand-in for the collective, in a sense. In terms of the languaging, memoir really calls upon general language rather than technical language. And memoirs are built on scenes, on sensory memory. So that's really, really important in memoir, just as important as it is in fiction. You've got to have scenes, you've got to have character development, you have to have dialogue. So I'm always asked, well, then, how can you possibly remember what was said 20, 30 years ago? And as soon as you start writing about dialogue or start writing dialogue, it does start to come back. The key element in memoir is reflection. What have I learned in the writing of this about myself, about the people that I'm writing about my culture, about my race? That's key to memoir. The early memoirs that were written in the 80s oftentimes did not have a lot of reflection. So I would say now one of the key aspects of memoir writing is reflection.
That's so interesting. I just picked up on what you said about the early memoirs in the 80s didn't really have that aspect. Who was writing memoirs at that time? Is there somebody specific that you're thinking of, or have there been some memoirs that sort of have stood out to you because they were actually more maybe depth focused, or had more of those different elements that you have talked about at self-reflection?
Yeah, I'd rather not mention the ones that weren't good. But I'd say the beginning of the 90s, we really started to look at some fabulous memoirs. Mary Carr wrote The Liars Club, which was about her growing up in West Texas. And in that book, she's not only exploring her relationship with her mother, who had she was a very creative person, but also had a mental illness and addiction. But she's exploring class, she's exploring gender, she's exploring the geography of West Texas and what that meant to her growing up. She's exploring the roots of her own addiction, that she was exploring her addiction in regards to growing up with this mother who was quite volatile. She was exploring her relationship with her sister. And she was really exploring moving out of that lower class into becoming an educated woman, who now is one of our most acclaimed memoirists and writers in this country. The other person whose memoir came out in the 90s made a huge difference in the writing of the whole genre, and that was Angela's Ashes with Frank McCourt, where he was exploring his culture as an Irishman in Limerick. And he took 30 years to write that memoir. He then divided it into 2 books, but in the 90s, we started to see people explore their lives in greater depth. And that has just continued. The great thing about memoir now is that now it's even being transformed into plays like Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. That was her memoir about her husband's death, and then it became a play. And Fun Home, which was a memoir about a young girl exploring her sexuality, became a musical on Broadway. So memoir has really expanded in the last 20 years.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And actually, I've read a couple of those that you mentioned. I remember reading Angela's Ashes probably right about the time that it came out. So that was 20 years ago almost. And yet it did have a very profound effect on me at the time. And so I think that this opportunity, again, coming back to the theme of healing, it seems like the writing of the memory or the memoir itself not only can be healing for the person who's doing it, mm-hmm. and even if that's not the intention to do it, I suspect it has a very profound aspect of that, but might also be healing for those people for whom that touches, who have the opportunity to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as I said before, we're not just writing for ourselves, we're a stand-in. Mm-hmm. And particularly when we're dealing with very difficult issues, if the person reading it identifies with that, and it's healing for them as well. So, I see most of memoir as healing, particularly the depth memoirs. When I was talking about the memoirs of the 80s, I think I was really talking about people who were writing more travelogues rather than using the element of reflection. They were writing, this happened, that happened, this is when I became famous, this is when I was challenged, without really saying, this is what I learned from it. Mm-hmm. I wrote my dissertation on memoir and calling it Memoir as Contemporary Myth, because I think our contemporary memoirists are our contemporary myth makers.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that there's so much opportunity for this to all come out. As you say, it's developed so much over the last 20 years or so that I think the more focus that we have on depth psychology and obviously the opportunity to go through a program such as the one that Pacifica is putting together, just expands that so much more to be able to provide those kinds of opportunities, both for the writers and for the the people who have the potential to read those. And I just wanted to mention, actually, I had a note from Jennifer this morning who was just sharing a little bit more about this program that they're putting together. And she gave me some information about what's actually going to happen in those online sessions. The fact that it's kind of a hybrid program where people can both have the opportunity to meet each other at the beginning and have exposure to you and to the other instructors, and then also go through those different sessions throughout those 8 or 9 months, and then have the closing kind of session. It's going to be a very interesting process of watching the development through a depth psychological process of these writings. And I do know that she mentioned that there will be some attention put to potential publication for some of the memoirs that are written by participants in the class, and also the opportunity perhaps even to group those together into an anthology or a booklet of their own. So that's very exciting.
Yeah, I want to mention something about the positive aspect of working as a collective, because I teach memoir every Thursday. I've been working with the same group over 8 years, and it's the process of the collective moving forward, feeling safe enough to be able to talk about their memories, to write their memories, and getting feedback from other people. And that's what this program is going to offer. The fact that it's online, that's still a community, that's still a collective that's going to be working together. And that really helps to deepen each person's memory, to deepen each person's story. I have a student that's just published her memoir about being one of the first women litigators in Los Angeles in the 70s. And her cases were extraordinary. Here she is, a single mother. And she was asked recently, could you have done this memoir without this group? And she said, no, I really needed the support of these women to feel safe enough to put my own journey out there.
That makes so much sense. I believe, it's the power of community, and the idea that others are also going through a very similar process to one's own, even if their life experience is absolutely completely different.
Yeah, we still have the same emotional truth.
Yes, which is something that you had mentioned in the beginning, and I actually made a note of that because you said that people are writing their emotional truths, and that's such a valuable term, because there's a lot of discussion about what is truth. Well, one's own emotional truth becomes something that can't be debated. I mean, you're the only one who has had that experience, and so you're the only one that can make that unique contribution to the world.
Right, and people, family members will say, well, it didn't happen that way. Well, of course, it didn't happen that way for them, but it did happen that way from the writer's perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's what's core. And I think particularly for women, if I think about the evolution of memoir, women's voices were not heard as much as men's voices up until the 70s. So to have the experience of being able to say, this is my emotional truth, and I stand by it. And as you just said, nobody can argue with that.
Yes.
And I want to make it clear, though, when you're writing memoir, you have to be very aware of the other characters that you're writing about. You can't write them two-dimensionally. They have to be three-dimensional characters. So you have to really get into the psyche of other people. That's what is healing. Mm-hmm. A person may have had a difficult relationship with a mother or a father, but then when they write all of these different episodes in their life, they start to understand the other person's point of view a little bit better. Mm-hmm. And that's very healing, very healing.
Very healing. And of course, that's another of the depth psychological aspects of doing this under this kind of a format, and being able to apply that depth psychological lens to it. I can just imagine that makes the characters, as you say, so much more three-dimensional, because I mean, in many ways, it is like writing a book of fiction, and not that everybody has that same experience, but from what I can understand about it, the books that I enjoy the most have the most depth or psychological depth to the characters, and when I read fiction, and memoir is absolutely the same way.
Yeah, 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 because then you can say, oh yeah, this was my experience too, but I never put words to it in the same way. Now I understand my own experience better.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, it gives us context and it also gives us meaning, which is what mythology does too, by the way.
Right,
We're able
right.
to locate ourselves within that story
Yeah, yeah. Or within many stories.
or within many stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let me just be clear, because you had mentioned, how valuable it is for women to be able to have this kind of support and community and to be able to speak their emotional truths. And this is absolutely true, and I agree. But what I also wanted to mention is, of course, that the Pacifica program is not just for women.
No.
There are certainly a lot of men, I'm sure, who also want to do something similar. And so what Jennifer said about the program, just so that everybody knows, she was talking about the people who might be interested in this are people who, number one, have always wanted to write a full-length memoir or even try their hand at just writing shorter reflections, just to get a feel for it. Also, people who have already written memoir pieces but would like to continue that process and maybe add the depth psychological aspect to things, or even just to do additional ones, but in this process of support and being able to have access to the community and to people like yourself and Jennifer and Daphne, who have all written a lot about these kinds of processes.
Yeah, I want to say something here because I think it's important for people to know they don't have to come into this program thinking, oh, I'm going to write a memoir. Writing small pieces is just as valuable. And there are many memoirs out now that are collections of small pieces. So a person doesn't need to know when they come into this program, what their grand project is going to be. They just have to put their toe in and see what comes out. That's the magic of memoir, because memoir, we're led by our memories. We're led by the image. So, I always ask my students to follow the memory or to follow the image and see where it takes them. So I really invite anyone who has ever wanted to write about their lives in one way or another to come to this program, because it's going to be fun.
It sounds like fun. It makes me want to do it.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is maybe people who are interested in writing down their own memories or participating in this aren't necessarily even planning to publish or ever show it to anybody. I mean, there might be some family stuff that they would never want their families to get a hold of, or, only speaking from personal experience, of course. But I think that there's also so much value in just being able to, for one's own self, have that experience of writing from a mythological consciousness and an archetypal kind of perspective of things, being able to make room in your own life for that so that you can just get that out and then see what emerges from that, because there might be other creative projects that completely are formed and take shape from that beginning birth of just writing your own memoir.
Right. I think a lot of people really want to explore their memories. Like, okay, I remember something from when I was a child. I have a different perspective on it now. And what did I learn? What did I learn over all of those years? And how has my angle of perception widened? That's what memoir gives us as well.
Mm-hmm.
A larger angle of perception. And in particularly, how it relates to the collective. I think that's really important, because in the beginning, memoir was criticized as being very narcissistic, as, a person just wants to focus on themselves. A good memoir really is, as I said before, it's rooted in a cultural perspective, a historical perspective, racial, gender. So, and I'm just thinking right now, a lot in the 90s, people were exploring their own sexuality. So, I mean, the whole person is explored in memoir.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole person. And we all have so many of those facets that we often don't share with the world, or even maybe that are somewhat hidden from ourselves, that are somewhat unconscious in ourselves.
Yeah, there's a lot of new memoirs coming out about people's spiritual lives, which are really beautiful.
Oh, that's exciting to hear.
Yeah, Danny Shapiro wrote a memoir called Devotion, and the title says it all. So, yeah, there's a lot to learn from memoir.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's really beautiful. You know, you had mentioned, Maureen, that I think you said your last book on memoir, your last memoir actually took you 13 years to write. You want
Yeah.
to say something about your process and what you learned in that?
I went into the process of writing that memoir to understand bipolar illness and addiction better. I'm a psychotherapist and the mother of a adult child who suffers with bipolar illness. So I thought I went in, I'm sure, with the concept of if I understand it enough, I'll be able to fix it. And I was quickly disavowed of that. So I had to understand my own participation in his illness. And finally, the book goes through all of my rescue attempts, all of the cycles of hope and despair I went through, and finally comes to a sense of acceptance of what is. And it took me 13 years to get there, and to be able to reshape it. I'm a slow writer, a careful writer. So I would say it probably went through 20 iterations. So I'm happy with it now, but it took that long.
Yeah.
It took that long for me to know what I was writing.
It makes me think about therapy. I mean, if one goes to therapy, sometimes it just takes as long as it takes, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet, if there is some movement, then there is also some healing in therapy or in anything that is therapeutic. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear that. And I mean, I don't know if you would have wished it to be any less. Did it feel like, I guess my question is, did it feel like work to you to do that? I mean, when I hear 13 years, it sounds like, wow, that's a lot of hard work, but I'm not sure that's what you would actually say.
Well, I'm a writer, and writing is work. And writing at any depth level takes time. So yes, the answer is yes, it was work, but I love writing. So it's both work and also partially my joy.
Yeah, joy. There's a word. That's a great.
Yeah. But also, I mean, truthfully, it's not easy getting a memoir published. Even I have a fairly good track record as a published author, but so many people are writing memoirs right now. It takes time to find the right publishing company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is another reason that I think, as I mentioned, there will be some conversations in this particular certificate program about how to get published, and maybe even an opportunity to publish through the group and
Right.
put that out there. So
Yeah.
it's very exciting. And one thing I should mention too that I know is that Kelly Carlin, who many people know as the daughter of George Carlin, is going to be at that closing residential at Pacifica. She's actually a graduate of Pacifica as well, and has written her own memoir called The Carlin Home Companion, Growing Up with George Carlin. Kelly's just a lovely, lovely person. I know her as well, and I just think she's amazing. And I have heard her say, actually, Maureen, that she gives a lot of credit to the process that she went through in your class at Pacifica to her being able to write that
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, she's lovely that she gives me credit, but that's when she started it. She started it in that class, and really took off. And she's great fun, so our students will really enjoy her presentation.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that students will have a chance to read some of their own writing that they've done over the course of the certificate in that closing.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to call it a closing ceremony because that's what it sounds like to me when I hear of it or think about it. But,
It is a ceremony because the whole community supports each writer and wants them to do their best, and it's really an amazing experience.
yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds amazing. Well, I'm really excited to see it take shape and to see who shows up for that. And if people want to learn more about that, they can go to pacifica.edu and click on the public programs link there. And then under current public programs, you can see it listed. So or just Google. I think if you just Google memoir and Pacifica and probably your name, Maureen Murdock, I'm sure that will absolutely show up there as well.
Yeah, I have it on my website.
Great. Okay.
www.maureenmurdock.com. And I want to go back to something that you said before, that this is for men also. I didn't mean to exclude men at all.
Yeah.
I was talking about kind of the evolution of memoir.
Yeah, and I don't think you did either at all. And so, but I wanted to make sure that that was clear, that it's open to absolutely everybody. And I think that if anybody who's been listening to this has been intrigued by anything we've said, I mean, as we talk about it, my own interest has definitely increased and grown as well. And so I think that, people will find it to be just a really lovely experience. And as you said, Maureen, I hope that people will visit your website as well, maureenmurdock.com. As you mentioned, you're also on Facebook, so they can find you there. And just as a reminder to everybody, that 9-month certificate course starts March. Actually, the first residential is March 30th through April 1st. And then, of course, the hybrid program, the online piece of it, will last for the following 8 months. And then there will be a closing retreat, residential retreat in Santa Barbara in December of 2017. And so, again, I've been talking to Maureen Murdock, who's a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist in private practice in Santa Barbara, and also obviously has a long history of writing and teaching memoir. And it's been really wonderful to talk to you today, Maureen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's been fun for me.
You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright.